On January 19th, 4 days before Turner, Admiral Spruance had sailed in the Indianapolis for Tarawa because he wanted a few days to consult with Admiral Hoover about the land-based air support the invasion would have. Nimitz had informed Hoover of the coming Marshall's operation on December 18th and called on Hoover to reduce the Japanese air forces at Votya, Malolap, and Mili. Affairs were improving. Nimitz could say casually that it will be possible for Towers to send you additional dive bombers if you need them, and have facilities for their operation. Nimitz expected a great deal, as a message to Hoover indicated. Reports from recent visitors to your area indicate that there will be no insurmountable difficulty in basing your heavy bombers in the Gilberts. With the shorter distances to their targets and the additional 2 weeks, the date had been postponed, in which to work, we hope for a successful demonstration of their effectiveness under conditions where they can carry a full bomb load. The deferment of the target date by 14 days should contribute to their success. That was Nimitz's quiet way of laying it on the line for a commander. He told the officer what he expected and why, and usually in plenty of time to let the officer explain his difficulties. Then, when the chips were down, Nimitz expected high performance. Hoover came back on December 24th with a report of difficulties. The building of camps for the heavy bombers was proceeding very slowly because the materials had not arrived in time, but Hoover hoped to move up 4 heavy squadrons by the middle of January, which would cut down the consumption of gasoline. As for himself, he hoped to move to Tarawa very soon. Hoover was busy. Like Nimitz, he believed in physical fitness, and he still played tennis energetically. Indeed, as one of his officers remarked, his flagship would no sooner moor in a harbour than someone was out building the tennis court. He was Towers's enigma, and some of his ideas amused Nimitz too. For example, Hoover had a yen to trade with the natives and had asked Nimitz for a barrelful of trade jewellery and knickknacks of the kind so prized in the Pacific of earlier days. He had already tried 6 times to get over to the native villages of the Ellis Islands for a trading expedition, but duty or the weather had so far kept him from it. On December 24th, as Hoover wrote to Nimitz, he was waiting eagerly for his trade goods to arrive and planning a little Christmas party on the beach for some of the nurses and all the admirals and generals in the vicinity. By the end of January, Hoover had about 350 planes working. They dropped several hundred tons of bombs on Mili, Votya, Roynamur, and Malolap. They drove Japanese shipping out of Jaluit, but Votya and Malolap were heavily defended, and after 3 B-24S were shot down by anti-aircraft fire over Malolap in one daylight raid, the big bombers were limited to night attacks, which were not very effective. They had problems hitting these targets. Malolap, for example, was out of range of fighters, so the B-24S had to go in alone, knowing they would have to run home pursued half the way by Japanese Zeros. On January 26th, however, Admiral Hoover gave the Japanese a good lesson. When the Zeros came back harrying the B-24S as usual, a squadron of P-40S lay in wait at the optimum distance they could achieve and shot down 6 of the Japanese planes. Even so, the distances were too great, and the inter-service organization not perfect either, and when Spruance arrived at Tarawa on January 24th, there was still plenty of Japanese air power left in and around the Marshalls. On the eve of the operation, Nimitz held his usual meeting of commanders, and again reminded them of what was expected. "That's all, gentlemen," he said then. "By the way, have you heard the one about the gob who was marooned with 6 nurses on a desert island?" The building tension was relieved, just as Nimitz knew it would be. A picnic was held just before that Marshall's operation. On Sunday afternoon, all Texans in uniform who were in Hawaii were invited to a giant Texas picnic in one of the city's big parks. General Richardson came from the Army, and Nimitz came from the Navy. He played horseshoes and laughed and joked with the soldiers, sailors, and Marines who were there. It was a long, busy, gay, exciting afternoon, with an estimated 40,000 servicemen in attendance at one time or another. Next day, the Honolulu Police and Sanitation Departments cleaned up the mess. They picked up 120,000 beer bottles from the bushes, and lunch cartons, K-rations, sea ration cans, pop bottles, used leis, a scattering of khaki shirts and other jetsam. The servicemen called it the greatest picnic ever, but to the police and sanitation men it was a pure disaster. 2 days later, Spruance sailed to make rendezvous with Carrier Task Group 58.2, which was Admiral Montgomery's force with the Essex, the Intrepid, and the light carrier Cabot. The fast carrier force was the most rapidly developing weapon. Halsey had learned a good deal about carrier tactics in the early days of the war, how to steam along under a protective overcast, and then launch aircraft to break into clear skies for quick strikes at the enemy. He had learned and taught others to make maximum use of anti-aircraft fire. But as the new battleships were coming off the ways, and the new cruisers and the fast destroyers, the fast carrier force was changing and its methods were altered as well. The fast carrier force still had all the speed of a long-distance runner, and now it had the muscle of a fullback. The fast battleships made the force a fast fleet that could take on the Japanese fleet and need not run from anyone. No longer was the carrier force a raiding outfit. If Fletcher and Brown had been right in their deep-seated belief that the carrier forces of 1942 must have surprise or risk annihilation, the same considerations did not apply in January 1944. The fleet now had the escort carriers to protect the beaches and the old battleships to give the necessary firepower against the fortifications. The old battleships were not suitable for command ships, but they had been replaced by special command ships, such as the Rocky Mount, which were floating wireless offices. So the fast carrier forces were able to range outside the beaches now. The question was simply how much and how far, and the answers to that still rested with Admiral Spruance. For a rear admiral, Mark Mitcher had a tremendous responsibility on the eve of the Marshal's invasion. He had 4 carrier task groups, 6 fleet carriers and 6 light carriers under his command, plus the fast battleships under Admiral Lee, 8 of them, and a huge flotilla of heavy cruisers, light cruisers and destroyers, all of which shared one characteristic: they could keep up with the 30-knot speed of the fast carriers. What had made the task force into the important striking arm was the huge train of oilers, ammunition ships, supply ships, and their attendant protectors, the escort carriers and destroyers. For instance, in the combined force that went to attack the Marshalls, there were 103 destroyers and escorts. To carry the 84,000 troops who would seize and occupy the islands, there were vessels that most officers of the United States Navy had not even dreamed of 3 years earlier: landing ships tank, landing ships dock, landing craft tank, landing vehicle tracked. Nearly all of these were the result of studies by men like Major General Holland Smith and Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner in the arts of amphibious warfare. On January 29th, the fast carrier force hit the Marshalls. One of the 4 task groups went to Malolap, 1 took Kwajalein, 1 Roy, and 1 moved against Votja. Mitcher's admirals were Rear Admirals Reeves, Montgomery, Frederick Sherman, and S.P. Jinder, who had replaced Radford when that admiral first became Chief of Staff to Towers, then moved on back to Washington for staff work. The Marshal's airstrikes were a triumph for the fast carrier forces, showing conclusively that 4 task groups could do in a few hours what land-based air had been unable to do in 2 weeks: knock out the Japanese air power that might threaten the invasion. On Roy alone they smashed nearly 100 planes, in the air and on the ground. The cost of the pre-invasion effort was 27 fighter planes and 22 bombers, with most but not all of the crews, losses due to fighters, anti-aircraft fire, collisions and other accidents. In ships, the cost was equally bearable. The destroyer Anderson was hit by shells from a shore gun, and her captain was killed, along with 2 other officers and 3 enlisted men. The battleship Indiana missed her turn in manoeuvring and smashed the battleship Washington, putting both out of action. This failure cost Captain J.M. Steele, lately of the Nimitz staff, his command and his chance for glory in the war. But the price was not high for what was secured. During the invasion that was to come, only 1 airstrike of any significance would be made by the Japanese from a long distance, and not 1 ship would be hurt by Japanese air. As for the Japanese, Nimitz did not know it, but they had decided against making a major stand at the Marshalls. The garrisons were, for all practical purposes, abandoned to their fate, with the understanding that they would fight to the end. Admiral Koga, charged with the defence, had guessed with Spruance, Turner and Smith that the Americans would attack the near Marshalls, Votia, Malalap and Mealy, and had shifted his defence forces to these islands that faced the expected line of attack from the east. The reinforcements he did get from headquarters went to these islands, leaving some 9,000 Japanese troops on Kwajalein and none at all on Majuro Atoll, whose major island was Darit. A marine scouting force that searched Dalap, Uliga and Darit Islands found that the Japanese had pulled out, but the force was unable to get the word to Admiral Hill before the bombardment of Darit began. The Japanese had left many buildings intact or unfinished, and the cruiser Portland and the destroyer Bullard began throwing in shells. Fortunately for the service forces, they did not hit anything important. At Kwajalein Atoll, the Americans began the assault of the northern and southern islands of the winding chain that surrounds the Great Lagoon, Kwajalein and Roy Namur. Rear Admiral Richard Connolly led the force against the northern bases on Roy and Namur Islands. His previous experience had been at Sicily, where he had distinguished himself and come to the attention of King, who had chosen him for the Pacific job, even as the planning was underway for the Gilbert's operation. He was an Academy graduate with War College experience, Naval Academy teaching, and Washington staff duty, all the indications of a coma in the officer corps. He and Kelly Turner did not agree on methods and tactics, but Connolly had been able to train his men independently, since Turner was engaged in operations during the fall, while Connolly was bringing his amphibious force into being on the west coast of the United States. Early on the morning of January 31st, the force moved in northeast of Roy. There were the problems of unfamiliarity and inexperience. Not enough Amphtrax to land all the assault troops on schedule, delays because of miscalculations of wind and currents. For 2 days the naval forces had stood offshore, battleships, cruisers. The island was declared secured, after some heavy fighting on Namur. This day Connolly's forces first took 5 little islets around Roy and Namur, at a cost of 24 killed and 40 wounded. These islands would become bases for field artillery, which would assist in the pulverization of Japanese fortifications on Roy and Namur. Connolly took his battleships in to a point 2,000 yards from shore for bombardment, and for this won the acclaim of the Marines and the cognomen Close In Connolly, a real term of endearment considering the Marine attitude toward the Navy. In spite of the failures in communications and the slip-ups of Green troops, the islands were secured by nightfall and the artillery was put ashore. Bombardment and harassment of the main islands continued until the morning of February 1st, when the major invasion of Roy and Namur was launched. "The magnitude of the Kwajalein bombardment was historic," said Holland Smith. For once he was completely pleased with his Navy cousins. Again there was confusion in getting ashore, but at noon on February 1st the assault waves landed on both islands. On Roy some 300 Japanese defenders were left alive, and by 1700 hours the island was declared secured after some heavy fighting. On Namur the resistance was heavier, but about 45 minutes after the landing an ammunition dump blew up, killing some 20 Marines, but God knew how many Japanese. Then 2 more ammunition dumps blew up on the island. The Japanese defenders resisted stoutly and usually killed themselves rather than be captured. By nightfall most objectives had been secured, but the island had not. During the night, the Green Marine troops fired in all directions, endangering themselves more than the enemy. In the morning, various small Japanese units staged suicide charges and were wiped out. By the afternoon of February 2nd, Namur was secured. In the south, Admiral Turner and General Corlett moved against Kwajalein Island. Never in the history of human conflict has so much been thrown by so many at so few, announced a joker aboard Turner's flagship Rocky Mount. This time the Navy was to be criticised for using a sledgehammer to smash an ant, but it was a criticism that no responsible officers, from King and Nimitz on down the line, would honour. There was friction again. Naval historian Samuel Eliot Morison wrote with some indication of glee that General Corlett, Army, threatened to put General Smith, Marines, under arrest if he came ashore and interfered with Corlett's operations with the 7th Army Division. Smith did not go ashore, but he was critical of the slowness with which the Army Division moved ahead on Kwajalein when the assault began on February 1st. It was called a beautiful assault, and if this was true, Holland Smith deserved much of the credit in more ways than one, because the 7th Division had been his baby in the beginning, back in the days when he trained those troops for the Adak invasion. The landing moved more slowly than that in the north. In contrast to the Marines, Morrison wrote, the army was taught not to advance until all possible fire had been brought to bear on the path ahead of the troops. Consequently, Holland Smith fretted for 4 long days and waited. Then, at the end of February 4th, Kwajalein fell and the basic islands of the atoll were secured. There would be another 20 little islands to take, in minor amphibious assaults, but Kwajalein was in American hands. The statistics leave room for argument about the techniques of Army and Marines. In the north, where 20,104 troops were committed, 195 Americans were killed and 545 wounded, while 3,472 of 3,563 Japanese were killed. That was the Marine operation. In the south, where 21,342 troops were committed, 177 Americans were killed and 1,037 wounded, while of 5,112 Japanese, 4,398 were counted as killed. That was the Army operation. It would seem, then, that the Marine way of moving ahead rapidly was not only quicker, but brought proportionately fewer casualties, and that was Holland Smith's stout contention. Yet in the total picture these were quibbles. The fact was that bombing and bombardment had kept the casualty figures of the Americans very low, and the operation was a great success. Kwajalein had been taken so quickly and with so few casualties that Spruance's team decided to move in on Eniwetok. It had been planned back at Pearl to let a month or two go by before launching an assault against this northwestern bastion, but all the commanders were flushed with victory. Spruance had spoken to Nimitz about this possibility before he left Pearl Harbor, and it was Spruance's opportunity as well as responsibility. As for the planning for Eniwetok, which became known as Operation Catchpole, Holland Smith claimed that he handed Kelly Turner a plan he had made out earlier. Morrison says the planning began at a conference aboard Turner's flagship among Turner, Admiral Hill, and Marine Brigadier General Thomas E. Watson. He does not mention Holland Smith at all in this connection. Hill took charge of the operation. The first task was to knock out enemy air that might strike the landing force, and this was done in massive carrier strikes on Truk on February 16th and 17, and on Saipan the next week. Here, Mitcher's fast carriers inaugurated a new technique, the night attack. At Truk, in 2 days and 1 night, the fast carriers flew 1,250 individual combat missions or sorties, dropping 500 tons of bombs and torpedoes on installations and shipping in the lagoon, knocking out 200,000 tons of shipping, including 2 auxiliary cruisers and a destroyer, to reduce the Japanese fleet. Actually, the air commanders did not consider this an optimum job. The carrier pilots did not do as well as they might have. Next day, Spruance took the surface forces on a sweep, looking for Japanese ships that might have fled Truk. With carrier support, he sank the Katori, a light cruiser, the destroyer Maikaze, and a trawler. The net result of the strike on Truk was to damage the Japanese Navy sorely and to knock out the base as a threat to Eniwetok, particularly when the fast carriers destroyed some 250 Japanese planes here. During those same 2 days, Admiral Hill's plans were complete, and he moved out of Kwajalein Lagoon with Task Group 51.1, the Eniwetok Expeditionary Group. One of the reasons for the tremendous success of the operation against Kwajalein had been the utter secrecy maintained, so that surprise was a major factor. For the first time in the Pacific operations, Tokyo Rose had not come on the radio to announce where the Americans were going, threatening them with terrible death and unheard-of tortures. But such was not the case with the Eniwetok operation. The cause, Chester W. Nimitz. On February 17th, Eniwetok D-Day, Admiral King wrote to Nimitz, cautioning him against talking to the press. "You may be surprised to know how widely you are quoted as the basis for comment and speculation as to what we are going to do next in the Pacific Ocean areas," King remarked. Referring to a recent Nimitz encounter with the press, King said, "In fact, you said nothing much but what would be obvious to military men of high status, but the use of it has, I fear, verged on giving aid and comfort to the enemy. You must watch your step in dealing with the press, etc. Basically, they care for nothing except their own kudos and the news, or interpretation of news, that will enable them to peddle more papers. Press and radio here can have left, no doubt in the minds of the enemy that our next objectives were Eniwetok and Ponape." Hill was excited with the prospects of this new operation, for his Majuro invasion had been so simple as to leave him half frustrated. The luck that he had felt with him at Tarawa had been strained. Oddly, the choice of Hill as an amphibious commander was due to much more than his work for Turner in Washington in earlier days. Indeed, he was not at all sure that Turner had anything to do with it. Much earlier in the war, Hill had been on the Murmansk run in the cruiser Wichita. He had been selected for flag rank, and while waiting for reassignment in Washington, had asked Admiral Jacobs, the Chief of Personnel, for temporary duty in Norfolk, where he could see the new specialized landing craft that would be used in amphibious operations. Much later in the war, Hill encountered Admiral King on one of the latter's visits to the Pacific, and King asked him how he liked his job. "I love it," Hill said. "Amphibious command is where the action is." Then King asked Hill wryly if he knew how he got the job. Hill professed ignorance, and King told him that it was because of that request for temporary duty to Norfolk, just to see the new developments in amphibious warfare. As luck would have it, Jacobs had told King about the young admiral's request. It had stuck in King's mind, and when Nimitz had requested a new amphibious commander, King had designated Hill, who by that time was running old battleships down in the South Pacific. Hill's luck had stayed with him at Tarawa. Why should he have had Tarawa anyhow, with his senior, terrible Turner, taking the much less exciting and much less challenging make-in operation? There was no mistake or guess involved. It was known that Markin was much less of a nut to crack than Tarawa. Hill once asked Turner why, and Turner turned him off with a wisecrack. The only way to see if a kid could swim, he said, was to throw him in head first. But that was not Turner's real reason. Tough as he was, and argumentative, and stickler for detail, and overbearing, he recognized ability, and he was a thorough officer. Hill had been chosen for the more interesting and more demanding task, because Turner was bogged down in detail at the time of the Gilberts, and something had to give, and because he took the position where he hoped the enemy fleet and air might strike. Now, going into Engebe and Eniwetok, Hill's luck was to be tried again. Already it was in the works. The Japanese had been ready to reinforce this marshal's outpost, but had not yet done so. Hill was in the communications command ship Cambria, a far cry from the old Maryland whose communications broke down and whose lights went out every time a gun fired. He had 9 transports, 8,000 men, Marines and Army, tanks and guns in LSTs and other landing vehicles. His fire support group, led by Rear Admiral J.B. Oldendorf in Pennsylvania, consisted of 3 battleships and 3 heavy cruisers. He had 15 destroyers and a group of escort carriers. Eniwetok provided a difficult problem of entry, which might not have been solved very easily except for a chart of the area captured from a beached Japanese patrol boat. Still, the invaders found a minefield and it had to be swept, so the invasion was off schedule. There were confusions, the transports made some wrong moves, a sub-chaser captain was relieved of command, and so was an artillery commander. But 2 little islands next to Engebe were captured that day, and the artillery was moved ashore. Next day, the bombardment began. First the guns spoke for an hour and a half, then the landing began, against a Japanese force of some 1,200 defenders. This time 3,500 American troops landed and took the island in that first day, with only 85 killed and 166 wounded. It was estimated that a third of the Japanese died in the bombing and bombardment before the landings. Next were Eniwetok and Parry Islands. Admiral Hill had been led to believe that these islands were vacant, but documents captured on Engebe showed that they were defended by shock troops of the Japanese 1st Amphibious Brigade. The news came late, shortly before the scheduled landings, and no aerial bombing had been planned, nor was there a sustained bombardment of the islands. There was no time for it, nor had the fire support ships brought the ammunition to do a thorough job. The lack of fire support was very definitely felt on the shore, where the resistance was the strongest yet encountered in the Marshalls. The landing force consisted of Marines and troops of the 27th Division, which had fought at Makin. Again, the Marines were far more adept than their army companions, and Admiral Hill said it was a question of poor command. Consequently, when the island was taken on the third day, Hill and General Watson decided to use the Marines alone to take Parry. On February 22nd, they landed there against very tough opposition, which included anti-tank mines. The Marines took the island in one day, killing most of the 1,350 Japanese defenders. At the end of that day, for all practical purposes, the Marshalls were under American control. To be sure, the Japanese still held important islands: Jaluit, Maloelap, Mili, Nauru, and Votje. These were heavily fortified, and the Japanese were dug in. The Americans bombed them often, the Japanese resupplied the islands occasionally by submarine, and they remained Japanese until the end of the war, but offered very little trouble. Operation Flintlock was the most successful amphibious attempt to date, and its success quieted many lingering doubts in Washington as to the usefulness of amphibious undertakings. The truck bombardment started C.J. Moore to thinking. Moore had been active in those last days before the war in preparing the war plan for the defeat of Japan. But in the months since, Nimitz had done a lot of talking about flying his flag on Truk, although the war plans called for the move to the China coast. In January, before they had set out for Kwajalein, Moore knew that the Joint Chiefs had decided on the Marianas campaign, but he did not know why. The reason was that the Joint Chiefs wanted bases for the B-29S, although that was not the Navy's only reason. So Moore suggested to Spruance that they bypass both Truk and the Marianas and head into the Celebes Sea. Spruance saw the memo and grunted. Admiral Pownall, who was riding the New Jersey as Spruance's air advisor on the operation, took a copy back to Nimitz, who took it with him to his next conference with King. Some commanders, such as Close-in Connolly, considered the Marshalls another turning point in the war. It was, they said, the point at which the inner defences of Japan were first breached, and the war assumed an entirely different aspect. For a number of reasons this statement was true, not all of them concerned with the geographical position of the Marshalls, the end of the legendary invincibility of Truk in the Carolines, or the coming offensive that the Japanese and everyone else expected in the Marianas. One reason for the change was that if the Gilbert's operation showed how strong the armada of the Fifth Fleet had become and tested the amphibious force, then the Marshalls proved the amphibious force's abilities and showed beyond doubt the massive strength that could be launched from Spruance's floating airfields. The air power of the Pacific was becoming overwhelming. Even in January came harbingers of things to come. On January 17th, Nimitz called a special conference in his office to deal with a dispatch that had come in from General Arnold in Washington. Foreseeing the defeat of Germany in the last months of 1944, General Arnold was thinking about redeployment of Army air forces in the spring of 1945. How would the Pacific command like 41 air groups in March or April of that year? 41 groups, that meant about 75 fighters and fighter bombers per group, or 48 medium and heavy bombers. 41? Admiral Towers shuddered a little when he considered the logistics. How would they employ so many planes? Two growing problems gave Nimitz a very good indication of worries yet to come in the prosecution of this war against the Japanese. Perhaps it was inevitable that success brought with it jealousies and struggles for power within the ranks of the victorious. This was certainly occurring in the United States' effort against Japan, as ambitious men, certain they were right, pressed their own cases as strongly as they dared. Not many were so ambitious or so convinced that, like J.J. Clark, they subverted authority openly. Fewer yet were as lucky as Clark. Thanks to King's personal intervention, Clark got his flag and assignment as a carrier task group commander just after Eniwetok. But other flag officers, particularly the air officers, were nearly trembling with ill-concealed ambition, and sometimes with ambition that was not concealed at all. About a year earlier, retired Admiral Harry E. Yarnell had been asked by King and others in the Navy Department to make a thorough study of the problems and opportunities of naval aviation in a changing military scene. Included in Yarnell's exhaustive report were the written opinions of as many senior naval officers as he could persuade to comment on the needs of naval aviation, and the opinions of not a few brave juniors as well. In this January, the report was in and under consideration. Admiral Yarnell had recommended that the Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet be an aviator, which would mean exit Nimitz if the report were accepted in the highest places. Yarnell's view and his support for it were spread throughout the aviation circle of the Navy. Rear Admiral H. F. Kingman, commander of Battleship Division II, suggested that Naval Air was taking the best young men of the Navy. He suggested a separate Naval Air Force. Admiral Halsey, who was first a ship sailor and then an aviator, suggested that all Navy officers be familiar with air matters. Admiral Kincaid said that while Navy Air had played an important part in the war in the Pacific in particular, it had been conducted generally along the lines visualized before the war. Kincaid, in other words, saw no basic need for change in the present state of affairs. Nimitz himself had replied candidly that he was not really intimately associated in the past with naval air over any extended period, and that was about all he said. Spruance said, "To begin with, I think there can be no doubt that aviation is required as an integral and essential part of our fleet. This aviation may be operated from carriers, it may be operated from shore bases, it may contain all types of aircraft from heavy bombers down to fighters." This was the case during Galvanic, where available planes of all suitable types were used most effectively. Without them, as without the supporting combatant ships, the transports and cargo vessels, and the assault troops, the operation would not have been carried out. Mark Mitcher, who would rather fight than write, and who had what he wanted anyhow, said nothing at all. Aubrey Fitch, who was a man of long experience in surface craft and airplanes like Halsey, felt that air and sea and submarine instruments were all to be welded into a team. The young Turks of the air service accounted for the outrageous and demanding statements, except for one of the more senior admirals, Frederick Sherman. Admiral Sherman was as ambitious as any admiral in the Navy, and had once aroused the ire of brother officers by admitting at a dinner party that he was tying his future to the carrier because that was the place to be for advancement, not because he had any particular commitment to naval aviation. Now Admiral Sherman wrote the most outrageous letter of all. "War at sea would be dominated by air in the future," said Sherman. "Our present organization and methods of conducting sea warfare are antiquated. Naval aviators should have the dominant voice in determining all naval policy, and not just naval aviation policy." One high-ranking officer remarked that naval aviation has an advisor in every office in the Navy Department, but authority in none. This situation is not satisfactory, and all questions of policy should be passed on, if not initiated by naval aviators, and should be satisfactory from all angles to that branch. I prefer to consider naval aviation as the Navy rather than a subordinate part of the Navy. Admiral Frederick Sherman then recommended that the following officers of the fleet be naval aviators at all times: Commander-in-Chief of the Fleet, Chief of Naval Operations, Chief of Naval Personnel, half the members of the General Board Commanders-in-Chief, all fleets commanders, all mixed forces also, on all staffs of all forces. Aviators should hold the offices of Chief of Staff, Operations and Plans. Reading Admiral Sherman's recommendations, an admiral from any other service might have grounds to wonder how anyone but naval aviators would ever achieve flag rank if those recommendations were followed, or how the Navy would be held together. Admiral Forrest Sherman, Nimitz's plans officer, who was every day gaining more and more of the boss's confidence, wrote very clearly that the job was to see that aviation units are operated by competent commanders with aviation experience, or with staffs which include sufficient competent senior officers with air experience. He placed importance on the fact that naval aviation was still of naval character. He knew the frustration of the younger pilots and their discontent, but he said there were other considerations. Forrest Sherman's view endeared him to King and Nimitz, as much as another Sherman's would make any senior commander, except an aviator, shudder. Admiral King was forced to take this matter very seriously. On January 29th he wrote Yarnell, saying he did not concur that the Pacific Fleet commander be an aviator. I cannot subscribe to any rule which would result in the removal on such grounds of Admiral Nimitz or any other admiral who has demonstrated the qualifications for high command. The question of air representation on the Pacific Fleet staff has been left to Admiral Nimitz's discretion. An officer who bears the responsibilities which he does should not be circumscribed in selecting the members of his staff. King also noted, however, that it was current policy to assign a naval aviator to command each carrier. As this controversy bubbled and the public relations controversy simmered, Under-Secretary Forrestal arrived in Pearl Harbor. He was vitally interested in air matters and in public relations matters, and what he saw did not much please him, as was to become apparent later. Admiral Turner was assembling his attack transports and supply ships in Lahaina roads these days. Admiral Nimitz thought it would be a good idea to show Forrestal the fleet from the sea, and he took him over on a destroyer. When they arrived and saw the fleet assembled, the destroyer skipper asked Nimitz what he wanted to do. Nimitz said he would like to go up and down the line of anchored ships so that the Under-Secretary might get a good look at them. They did, but a destroyer moving past a line of anchored vessels at 25 knots or so creates a bit of fuss, and some of the anchored vessels began to roll in the wake. The Commodore of the transport squadron took exception to the destroyer's speed and sent a message. "I do not like your sea manners." The signalman showed the message to Nimitz's aide, who showed it to the admiral. Nimitz smiled and ordered his 4-star flag broken out over the destroyer. Then came another message, an apology from the transport squadron commodore. Nimitz decided that he would take the Under-Secretary to inspect this ship, so the destroyer was stopped and a boat put over the side to take them to the transport flagship. All the way across, the enlisted men and the admiral's aide tried to signal to the transport that the Under-Secretary of the Navy and the commander of the fleet were coming. But no one paid any attention. They arrived at the gangway with no recognition at all. The young ensign, who was officer of the deck, was simply oblivious. On the quarterdeck, the admiral was not pleased. The captain and the commodore were roused quickly enough and came struggling into their uniform jackets as men who had been awakened from their afternoon naps. Nimitz then made a thorough inspection of the ship, and what he saw did not please him very much. He said so, and the officers blanched. Then, in thoroughly good humour, Nimitz returned to the destroyer. Forrestal's flag was broken out at the peak, and the ship raced back to Pearl at 30 knots. These little excursions did not get Nimitz away from his real worries for long. He was almost immediately plunged into other difficulties. The Joint Chiefs of Staff had directed Nimitz and MacArthur to get together on plans for future operation in the South and Southwest Pacific and submit joint recommendations. Getting together with MacArthur was not easy unless one was willing to take second seat. Halsey knew this from experience, despite his admiration for MacArthur. In the matter of public relations, for months Lieutenant Commander Bassett had been trying to get the right to release news of South Pacific operations from the South Pacific. But MacArthur had insisted that nothing be said from Noumea until MacArthur's communiqué from Brisbane had first been sent out. Thus the public had a hazy idea that everything that went on in southern climes was MacArthur's doing, and it was never established that MacArthur's headquarters did anything to correct this misinterpretation. This pettiness rankled. It bothered the officers, it bothered the public relations officers, it bothered commanders in Halsey's command who were aware of it, and it bothered the newsmen in the South Pacific who lived with it. But the public relations problem was as nothing compared to the command problem. In December, General Sutherland, MacArthur's Chief of Staff, had been on the road, trying to convince higher authority that the Navy's Central Pacific operations ought to be wiped out. Even as the amphibious forces were moving against the Marshals, Sutherland was in Pearl Harbor, ostensibly to listen. Sutherland came to the morning Nimitz meeting on January 25th, along with Generals Richardson, Harmon, Kenny, and Chamberlain. Nimitz was there, of course, along with McMorris, Newton, Lockwood, Calhoun, Gormley, Kincaid, Towers, and Forrest Sherman. The last named was asked to discuss the overall operations plan for 1944, which the Nimitz staff had drawn up, and Sherman unfolded it. Operation Granite was the name. It was the first time he had ever been able to get anyone in the Navy to make a definite statement, said Sutherland, as Sherman gave target dates, such as June 15th for the invasion of Truk. For several days, the representatives of the two basic commands exchanged views, with the understanding that the Central Pacific operations would continue, while MacArthur moved up New Guinea. There was perfect agreement. Sutherland presented a plan for coordinated operations, and everyone thought it was fine. Kinney, Harmon, Richardson, and Towers lunched together on January 28th, and by that time everything was all settled. But was it all settled? Early in February, Sutherland was in Washington again, presenting quite different views to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the old MacArthur views that MacArthur must lead the show up the New Guinea Trail to the Philippines. By February 8th, the fat was definitely back in the fire, and Admiral King in Washington was furious. On that day he wrote to Nimitz, having received and read the minutes of the meetings at Pearl Harbor, and having been subjected to the new pressures applied in Washington by Sutherland. Indignant dismay was King's term for his emotions. The reason, all that agreement at Pearl Harbor that the proper method of conducting the campaign against Japan was to accept MacArthur's view of moving up the Philippines. He was particularly upset because Towers and Calhoun seemed to have joined the MacArthur camp. This view does not appear to have been refuted by any other members of the conference. The other Pacific Ocean areas, members of the conference expressed the view that there was a possibility of bypassing the Marianas and the Carolines. Apparently, said King, no one had bothered to consider when the Marianas and Carolines would be wrested from Japan. I assume that even the Southwest Pacific advocates will admit that sometime or other this thorn in the side of our communications to the Western Pacific must be removed. King was furious because Towers had stated, and was unrefuted, that the object of taking the Marianas was to provide a base for B-29S to bomb Japan. That may have been the airman's object. To King it was only a useful corollary. The Marianas were to be taken to dry up the Carolines and to speed up the clearing of the line of communications to the Philippines. King was holding for the Marianas and the Carolines. If the Japanese fleet was too strong, they must take Truk. If the Japanese fleet was weakened enough, they could bypass Truk and take the Marianas. King went on. The idea of rolling up the Japanese along the New Guinea coast, throughout Halmahera and Mindanao, and up through the Philippines to Luzon, as our major strategic concept, to the exclusion of clearing our Central Pacific line of communications to the Philippines is to me absurd. Further, it is not in accordance with the decisions of the Joint Chiefs of Staff who made their decisions, after hearing all of the points of view expressed in the minutes of your conference. The Commander-in-Chief was at some pains, he always wrote a very clear letter, to show that he was not merely piqued. The letter began with fulsome praise for Nimitz's brilliant and accurate concept for the Marshall Islands campaign, and the energy with which everyone concerned has grabbed the ball in exploiting the favourably developing situation. King realized that Nimitz, McMorris, and Sherman accepted the need for taking Japan from the Korea-China side, but he was critical of Nimitz for not maintaining these views strongly vis-à-vis MacArthur's officers. He was also upset because so many of Nimitz's officers presented views so divergent from his. The Admiral ended the letter with a restatement of his strategy for the defeat of Japan. The enemy would be forced eventually into the inner ring of Japan, Korea, Manchuria, and Shantung Peninsula. Everything must be related to that forcing. China must be used as a base with Chinese manpower securing it. The Japanese should be cleared from the Carolines, Marianas, and Palaus, then take Luzon, which would open sea routes to the China coast. Then Chinese ports would be taken, and the link-up made with the Chinese land forces, which could move up the coast. The occupation and use of Mindanao, which MacArthur wanted, would require roll-up against tremendous difficulties, King said. Until the very successful raid on Truk by the fast carriers, Nimitz had considered an assault on that base as necessary. By February 17th, King was so concerned about this apparent plan that he wrote again, advocating the taking of the Marianas next. By this time, however, Nimitz had made a trip to the Marshalls to see what had been accomplished there. Nimitz wrote King on February 22nd, still not having made up his mind finally, but leaning toward the Marianas on the basis of what he had learned of the disposition of the Japanese fleet. He was still awaiting news of the strikes Mitcher was then making against the Carolines. By February 29th, all was settled in Nimitz's mind. The tremendous success of the fast carriers against Truk, the damage they had done, and the flight of the remains of the Japanese fleet from that once powerful base had led him to embrace the Marianas' attack wholeheartedly. Sinkpak's Plans Division that day presented Operation Forager to the assembled staff, the operation for the capture of the Marianas. King was still uneasy about the direction of affairs in the Pacific, with so much of Nimitz's staff apparently falling down before the onslaught of the MacArthur mystique. He brought Nimitz to Washington for conferences early in March. The aviator issue was still before them. They discussed the question of making commanders who were line officers take aviators as chiefs of staff, and making aviator commanders take line officers as chiefs of staff. The Navy was also having problems with the air forces. The Army did not like working under Admiral Hoover, and Army officers had suggested to Nimitz that they come directly under him as Commander-in-Chief of Pacific Ocean areas, or under Spruance as Commander of the Central Pacific. Nimitz, however, stood stoutly behind Hoover. King and Nimitz reviewed their strategy for the Pacific in light of the highly successful Marshall's operation. They had many problems regarding MacArthur's Southwest Pacific Command, and they did not seem very close to solving them. Halsey wanted to move into Emirau Island, but Nimitz doubted if MacArthur would agree. They talked again about Truk, and Nimitz said he was now certain the Japanese would never again use Truk as a naval base, except perhaps as a staging area in connection with some particular mission. He wanted to move against the Marianas. Admiral King wondered why Nimitz wanted to use the Marianas as a fleet base. Why not Eniwetok as the big naval base? The question, however, kept coming back to Truk and whether they should take it. And that question hinged on the acceptance of the Navy Plan or the MacArthur Plan for operations in 1944. The trip to Washington came at a fortuitous time. Nimitz's daughter Catherine was getting married that week, and he was able to attend her wedding to James T. Leigh, a graduate of the Naval Academy class of 1931. He was also the subject of something of a plot on the part of the Waves and the Lady Marines. The commanders of these two august organizations had long been wanting to infiltrate the Pacific theater of war, but Nimitz had a thing about women in the war theaters. He simply did not want women around, and the Navy nurses were the one exception that he could not control. He would not accredit women correspondents to the fleet, and when one lady, Peggy Duell, managed to secure a card, he had it revoked. Nor would he allow the ladies to come to Pacific Fleet headquarters, although the Waves and the Lady Marines tantalized him in Washington with the fairest flowers of their respective corps. Nimitz was back in Pearl Harbor by March 21st, with solid commitments for the continuation of the Central Pacific amphibious offensive. That day he wrote Admiral McCain, Chief of the Bureau of Aeronautics in Washington. Our problem in the Pacific is one of moving rapidly over great distances with limited logistic resources. Accordingly, we must ruthlessly reduce base developments and garrisons, both land and air, to the minimum which will suffice. As long as we maintain the offensive and keep rolling westward, our essential needs at advanced air bases are fighters for aid defense and heavy and medium bombers for long-range attack and for search. Short-range striking aircraft are of little value, except where there are active enemy bases within their reach, unless the enemy resumes offensive operations and thereby presents ship targets. He did not expect that to happen in the Marshalls. Nimitz believed the Navy ought to stick very closely to its carrier-type training and not get into either the field of land-based fighters and light bombers, which the Marines held, or heavy and medium bombardment, which was the province of the Army. He told McCain so in this letter, an indication of his preoccupation with the problems of the new fast carriers. The matter of military policy still bothered Nimitz, for he must have total agreement with MacArthur on the general plan for 1944, and he did not have it yet. He did, however, have the backing of the Joint Chiefs in the Navy program for the Central Pacific, and so it was not hard for Nimitz to be gracious. He had invited MacArthur to come to Pearl Harbor, but MacArthur had steadfastly refused to move out of his own bailiwick. Now Nimitz decided that he would go to Brisbane to try to smooth the ruffled feathers of the peacock of the Southwest Pacific. It was easier said than done. According to military protocol, Nimitz was junior to General MacArthur, who had been a general officer when Nimitz was still a commander, so Nimitz had to ask permission to go to Australia and MacArthur's command. His pretext was that he wanted to visit the naval forces in the Southwest Pacific. MacArthur very graciously invited Nimitz to visit him in Brisbane, as Nimitz hoped he would. Then the Admiral began making preparations for the journey. He sent his aide, Lieutenant Commander Lamar, into Honolulu to have several silk playsuits made up for little Arthur MacArthur, the General's son. Lamar also laid in a stock of Hawaiian candy for Mrs. MacArthur, and Nimitz collected a flock of orchids to give the lady, preserving them by inserting their stems in little glass tubes filled with water. Then they set off by flying boat to Brisbane. MacArthur met them at the dock. That first night he invited Nimitz and his aide to dine with the MacArthurs in their suite in Lenin's Hotel, across the street from the Queensland Houses of Parliament. The gifts were delivered, and the General was nearly as pleased, it seemed, as little Arthur in his play-suit. MacArthur was very mellow. During the visit, Nimitz discovered that one of the difficulties between the commands was MacArthur's staff policy. General Sutherland, the Chief of Staff, simply did not show MacArthur all the dispatches from the Nimitz headquarters, but summarized, and sometimes this led to troubles and misunderstandings. Halsey had the same trouble. He had visited MacArthur a few weeks before to try to settle a misunderstanding about Manus Island. Halsey had wanted to make Manus an advanced naval base, and had proceeded to send materials there for that purpose, with the agreement of King and Nimitz. But Manus was in MacArthur's territory, so Nimitz had suggested by dispatch that MacArthur yield Manus to the Navy. MacArthur's sense of possessiveness was outraged. No one had explained the need to him, and it appeared that the Navy was simply trying to whittle down his command, particularly so in light of the decisions of the Joint Chiefs of Staff regarding operations in 1944. It had taken Halsey 2 days of persuasion to convince MacArthur to let him have the island. Now MacArthur was furious because at Nimitz's suggestion in Washington, Emirau had been substituted for Kavieng, and Halsey had moved right ahead, taking the island before Nimitz arrived in Brisbane. MacArthur, meanwhile, had landed forces on New Britain. The twin movements had cut off Rabaul, which no longer threatened the Allies, and had encircled some 80,000 Japanese in New Britain and New Ireland and the Solomons. The South Pacific campaign was over, and so was the interlude. March 1st, June 18th, 1944. In the middle of March 1944, Admiral Spruance was off in Majuro Lagoon, conducting training exercises against the Japanese-held islands of the Marshalls. One might say that the Japanese on the islands were perfect foils for the training program. The ships would come in to practice bombardment techniques, and the Japanese on such islands as Mealy never failed to shoot back with their shore batteries. The result was that the United States Navy could learn fast, practicing, as it were, with live ammunition against real but not overly dangerous targets. Spruance was troubled by one decision made in Washington and at Pearl Harbor. By the end of March, King and Nimitz had definitely decided that non-aviators in command had to have aviators as chiefs of staff, and aviators had to have non-aviators. Thus, Hoover was instructed to find a line officer for his staff, and Spruance was told that Captain Moore must go. Ching Lee, the battleship commander of the Fifth Fleet, was also instructed that he had to bring in an aviator to his fast battleship force. As the war continued and the relationships became more complicated, Nimitz's celebrated diplomacy was sorely tried in many areas. Dealings with MacArthur remained difficult. When Sutherland and other Southwest Pacific officers had come to see Nimitz early in the year, the Pacific Fleet public relations people had prepared a press release about the meetings on instructions from the Admiral. As a courtesy, Nimitz sent a copy of the release to MacArthur before giving it out, suggesting simultaneous release. Back from MacArthur came a hot message saying that the General could see no possible reason for issuing a press release, and the matter was dropped right there. But when Nimitz went down to Brisbane to visit MacArthur, the General made sure a press release and pictures were given out immediately. The mountain had come to Mahomet, and sometimes the war seemed to get completely bogged down in red tape, as on the occasion when Admiral Turner tried to deliver a captured Japanese flag to the Secretary of the Navy. One of Turner's officers, Captain J.H. Doyle, was detached from the Turner team and sent back to Washington to other duty after the successful invasion of the Marshals. Turner gave Doyle a battle flag as a souvenir and told him to deliver it to the Secretary of the Navy. Doyle then proceeded to get thoroughly mixed up with the Washington commandos in the Navy Department. He reported in to Admiral Cook in Washington and mentioned the flag. Cook was only half hearing him, because he and King were about to leave for London that day, so he told Doyle to discuss the matter with Admiral Edwards, Deputy Chief of Naval Operations. Edwards was dubious. "There's a lot of protocol missed up in that," he said. "What does Nimitz think about it? Maybe Nimitz should be presenting it to the President." Doyle explained that Turner had been on the scene at the Marshals and Nimitz had not. It was a gift from Turner to the Secretary of the Navy, just like the flag from Guadalcanal that Turner had sent the Secretary earlier. Edwards was still dubious. "Don't do anything," he said, "until I let you know." Doyle waited. He talked to Admiral Delaney in the Navy Department, and Delaney was soothing but not solving. Doyle threatened to return the flag to Turner. Delaney said he would get answers. Doyle then sat down and wrote a letter, to be signed by Edwards, to the Vice Chief of Naval Operations, asking for a flagpole to be installed in Doyle's office. Insofar as practicable, all materials used in the construction of the flagstaff should be critical, except that the stand must be constructed of hand-carved protocol. The memo went out into the morass of official paper. A week went by, and nothing happened. In the middle of the second week, Doyle was notified that he could deliver the flag to the Secretary of the Navy, but he was not to mention the delay or try to explain it. So Doyle took the flag to Secretary Knox, who was very pleased to have it, and brought in photographers to have the presentation recorded. At the beginning of the third week, the picture appeared in the Washington newspapers, with a caption that identified Doyle as the man who hoisted the flag on Kwajalein. The war was growing infinitely more complex, as anyone could see. One result of the complexity, as detailed here, was the increasingly important lack of understanding between the Nimitz Command and the MacArthur Command. Each day the differences seemed to mount. Each week the approaches spread further apart. The solution did not lie on the MacArthur-Nimitz level, however, but on the King-Marshall level, and unless it could be resolved in Washington, no one could expect it to be settled at all. By this time, 1944, in spite of the growing administrative troubles of a complex organization, which so often manifested themselves in human pettiness, the fighting team of the Pacific was stronger and more effective than it had been before. In the process of weeding out all but what Nimitz referred to as the first team in combat command, some injustices were done, which Nimitz was as quick to recognize as anyone. But like Halsey, Nimitz had taken the position that personal interests could not possibly be considered in wartime. Nimitz might have brought Mrs. Nimitz to Honolulu, he might have engineered leaves for himself, but he lived a sternly Spartan life at Pearl Harbor, attending relatively few of the social functions in the busy whirl of civilian life. On one occasion he was eager to get to the West Coast, where his daughter was christening a ship, but such a trip did not fit any of King's plans, and so it was immediately abandoned. By 1944, then, there was a feeling in Washington and at Pearl Harbor that the job was being done properly. "You have a good team here now in the Pacific," Under-Secretary Forrestal wrote to President Roosevelt on the occasion of a visit to Pearl Harbor early that year. "The contrast between a year and a half ago and today is as between night and day." That is not to say that all was sweetness and light. Far from it. In the Central Pacific, terrible Turner raged and drove his officers, sometimes nearly to distraction, trying to get them ready for the Marianas landings. Admiral Hoover was in almost constant argument with General Hale, the Army Air Force commander who ran the Army's land-based fighters and bombers that supported the Pacific operations of the Navy. In February, Hale had made a trip away from his base without consulting Hoover, and Hoover was furious enough to complain to Nimitz, who tried to smooth it over. The relations between Nimitz and Towers were always strained. Both men walked on eggs. Towers was almost constantly frustrated because his aim in life was a combat command, and he was not getting it. Nimitz was well aware of the persistence of the airmen, and he was generally very patient with Towers' constant state of irritation, knowing that the growing weight of logistical worries, which were the burden of the deputy to Sinkspack, were a major cause of Towers' troubles. Even though Baldy Pownall had taken over as air commander in the Pacific, the airmen still tended to come to Towers with their troubles, adding to his burdens, but not altogether without reason. Towers still regarded himself primarily as an aviator and interested himself most in the aviation problems. He took a strong dislike to Admiral Hoover, for example, and was very critical of that admiral. There was, then, friction among what might be called Nimitz's lieutenants, all the more reason that Nimitz was the ideal commander for the Pacific Ocean areas, just as MacArthur was an ideal commander for his region. That there was friction between and within the commands was not surprising. That there was so little damage to the war effort by that friction is somewhat remarkable. Admiral H.B. Salada, an airman himself who served part of the war in the Bureau of Aeronautics, part at sea, later contrasted the American war effort with his own studies of that of Germany. "I can't avoid a feeling of pride," he said, "at the friendly and cooperative feeling that prevailed within our Naval High Command throughout the war." Most irascible of all the Nimitz lieutenants was Holland Smith. He might have been a very happy general if the amphibious operations had been run his way. That way called for the Navy to provide ships, lots of ships with big guns, and to transport the Marines to an island, throw the complete weight of naval air power against the island for several days, bombard the island steadily for perhaps 10 days, and then let the Marines walk ashore. Actually, if Holland Smith's plans had ever been worked out to perfection, the way he wanted them, a company of Marines might well have taken Tarawa. But the Navy was not running amphibious operations in Holland Smith's way, and would not do so. Kelly Turner included Smith in his planning. In fact, despite Smith's complaints about the insufficiency of the Tarawa bombardment, he and his staff had been in on the planning of it. Turner's rule of thumb, an absolute dictum nonetheless, was that no aspect of the landing operations would be put in the master plan until and unless Holland Smith and his staff had approved. The bombardments were subject to the vagaries of war. In the case of Tarawa, the invasion fleet had gone in with orders from Nimitz himself to get the hell in and get the hell out. The Japanese fleet was at large, and for all anybody knew, it might sally forth to destroy the American invaders. Of course, no one, from King to Nimitz to Spruance, wanted to risk an invasion force that they had worked so hard to prepare. The conflict between Holland Smith and his Navy friends was largely a matter of different views of the war, from very different vantage points. Just as King and Nimitz saw the war from different positions, so did Admiral Turner and General Smith. Turner was responsible for the landing and protection of the troops, and for the safety of his ships, as well as the overall success of the invasion of an island, 2 islands, or 3 islands, as the case might be. If Admiral Hill, for example, had somehow failed at the Gilberts, Turner would have been responsible, unless the failure could be attributed to some deviation from orders or some immense gaffe, even though he was at Macon while Hill was at Tarawa. Had the Marines been driven off Tarawa, Turner would have been responsible to Spruance.